Stephen, don't let Tenny go out. Teach her a good lesson. Teach her a very good lesson.
Men, we can't live without them, yet still can't live with them. Men, why we hate them. What were you doing with my girlfriend? Nonso continued, raising his voice. It's not what you think, I quickly interrupted. I met him downstairs and accompanied him to his room so I could help analyze clips from his new movie. I explained, hoping he would calm down. Am I supposed to believe what you just told me? Nonso asked, coming closer. I looked back at him and saw the disappointment on his face. He shook his head, walked back into his room, and closed his door. I was left to face Nonso all by myself. So much for still being in love, I muttered. He couldn't even wait to defend me. I can't believe I spent my money and time on this trip just to make up for cheating on you. And you came here knowing full well you are doing the same with your side guy, he hissed. Then, looking at me in disgust, I guess I can stop trying to please you now, since we're even.
Gosh, this Nonso. Must everything be about you? I guess we're not even. I have to stop explaining now because we're not even. Who told you you're even? Can you compare what just happened to what you did to her? Let's start from the tape in the beginning. Let's continue with Kinga. Let's continue with everything that you have been doing so far. And you're saying we're now even. I don't see how this is even, Nonso. Better get your facts straight.
I tried to explain how it was all a misunderstanding, but my explanations fell on deaf ears. He walked away and returned to the room, leaving me standing alone in the corridor. I'm sure you must have already guessed that my entire trip became a nightmare after that. Nonso spent most of it ignoring me and making my life miserable for a crime I never even committed. I was so happy when Sunday morning finally came and I could finally go back home. If you thought I was excited about going to Calabar, you should have seen me on our way back to Lagos. I couldn't wait for the plane to land. As soon as the fasten seatbelt signs had been switched off, I was at the front of the plane. I didn't bother waiting for Nonso. It was no use. He hadn't said a word to me throughout the flight. And I was tired of begging, especially since I wasn't guilty. When Sandra asked how my trip went later on a Monday morning at work, I lied to her and told her it was awesome. There was no way I was letting her know I had just had the most horrible 48 hours of my life. Not after she had told me how much she wished she was in my shoes. There were so many activities to dread that week, and I wasn't prepared for any of them. Topping the list was the documentary series meant to start with Nancy's company. My boss had informed me at a meeting we had earlier in the morning that the project would kick off on Wednesday. So I was already prepared for a terrible week ahead. Stephen called just as I was about to close from work to say that he was back in town and was on his way to the house to settle the family issues we were having. By the time I was home, he was already talking with Mom. I joined them in the living room as we all pondered what to do about Dad. Mom told us that she couldn't stand to see her husband in the arms of another woman, especially after all they'd been through together. She begged Stephen to allow her move in with him, or at least rent a flat for her to stay in while things sorted themselves out. Stephen understood her plight, but insisted on hearing Dad's side of the story before making any decisions. He said he would allow Mom to move out of the house if the discussion and negotiations with Dad were unfavorable for her. He believed that Mom moving out of the house would only leave more room for more young girls to surround Dad, causing more harm than good. I hoped Stephen could perform some magic and talk sense into Dad. He was our last hope. Dad always respected his opinions and listened to him. I'm pretty sure he never wanted Stephen to learn about his escapades with younger girls because he'd be too ashamed to face him. Stephen didn't let Dad know he was around because he wouldn't come home with Tenny like he usually did. So we discussed other things and patiently waited for Dad to arrive. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., there was a horn at the gate, and shortly after, we heard the car in the driveway. Within a few minutes, he walked into the living room with his side chick following behind. Tenny had become his shadow in the last few days, following him everywhere he went. I wouldn't be surprised if she followed him to the toilet too. Dad froze in his steps when he entered the house and realized that Stephen was sitting in the living room. I saw him motion to Tenny to go back into the car, but it was too late already. Stephen had seen her.
Motion to Tenny to go back into the car. What? He's scared of his son? Because he knows what Stephen is capable of. Hey, please, Stephen, don't let Tenny go out. Teach her a good lesson. Teach her a very good lesson. Huh? I can't wait to see what happens next.
Tenny, on the other hand, didn't notice he was in the living room until he shouted her name. Tenny, what are you doing with my dad? Everyone turned to face them. I couldn't even begin to pick who looked more confused between Dad, Mom, and myself. If anyone walked in at that moment, they would have thought there was a competition to find a family member who could look the most confused. Tenny wasn't the least bit shocked to see Stephen. She stared at him without remorse, while the rest of us waited for explanations. Can someone please tell me what's going on here? Mom asked, finally breaking the awkward silence that filled the room. I could hear my heart pounding as I waited for a response. Tenny and Stephen stared at each other with anger in their eyes, like long-lost enemies that still had unfinished scores to settle. But none of them said a word. We were kept in suspense as I tried to make sense of what was happening in my father's house.
Hey, from one drama to the next, which one is the one that Tenny and Stephen are now staring at each other? Like, where did they know each other from? I'm trying to think, what can be the connection? Because it's Sonia and Tenny that are schoolmates. And Sonia and Stephen, the age gap is quite wide. So I'm not sure that Tenny can possibly be Stephen's schoolmates. What do you think? What do you think is really going on? Could they have known each other from the past or something? Anyway, let's find out what happens in the next episode. If you're enjoying the story so far and you really don't want to have to wait till the next episode, then there's good news for you. The book is actually available in paperback and ebook format
on Amazon and Seller.
So you just need to go to Amazon and type in Men Why We Hate Them by Olufemi Idowu, and it will bring up the book, and you get to choose whether you want the ebook, paperback, or the audiobook.
For users that don't have access to Amazon, you can download the ebook on seller.co.
And you get to read these and many more exciting titles from yours truly. Men, Why We Hate Them.